Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. On this podcast, my goal here is to help you with your fantasy writing, whether you are a beginner or maybe even a barbarian. What does that mean? I'm still trying to figure that out. I think being a barbarian fantasy writer just sort of means that you don't know kind of where you are in terms of writing fantasy, but you just know that you want to get a little bit better. You want to write great stories and for great people to read them. So I guess that's what I'll go with for now. Now, on this show, what I usually do is I react to a prompt from either a listener or something procured to me from our producer, Natalia Emmons. And so we're going to do that today. I have not read this prompt yet, but I'm very excited to get into it. And I'm going to open it up now and see what we got. All right, so this comes to us from username Artemis Leica, who writes this in the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. And Artemis writes, tests or competitions for marriage candidates that are not combat focused. So it looks like they're looking for some brainstorming. Here's what they wrote. I'm trying to come up with some tests or challenges, bonus if they are dangerous or deadly, but I don't want them combat focused. I'm looking for tests that are focused on what makes a good queen to be. So not just traditionally feminine activities, focused like sewing, dressing, dancing, etc., though open to interesting takes on those too. Some traits I'm thinking of are cunning/intelligence, possibly magical ability, though not restricted to a specific kind of magic, and things along those lines. Think Harry Potter challenges in the first book to get to the stone, but with potential brides who will become queen to a cursed kingdom. Ooh, a cursed kingdom, oh. So far, I have tried getting book suggestions in the fantasy romance subreddit, but most of the suggestions had the female main character competing in combat-focused trials like archery or even sword fighting. The Google searches are not giving me the tests or combats from books, so I have to find book titles and then look for summaries. For context, there is a man doesn't think of himself as a prince, who is cursed and unattractive and who needs a bride to take the throne in his kingdom. He comes to another kingdom which has to supply him with a bride meeting certain requirements. Why they have to and what those requirements are still being brainstormed. The kingdom has several groups offering up candidates, and they will get some kind of benefit if their candidate is chosen. One group planned a specific person to be their candidate, but something happens and she's not available. They are desperate and end up choosing the female main character, who is a necromancer hiding as a witch. Oh my goodness. Necromancy is feared and possibly punishable by death in her kingdom, not set in stone. She has a friend or mentor who knows the truth and thinks leaving for the cursed kingdom might be good/safer for her. She doesn't want to compete and she's terrified she'll be outed in the challenges, but she has no choice, so she competes. And she loses the last challenge because she sees another candidate close to losing in a way that would mean death for that candidate. So she accepts losing to help the other candidate. 3 other women win all the trials, but the cursed man decides the female main character didn't lose the last one for some reason. She showed whatever trait was being tested in another way, or possibly the man thinks her compassion will help with what he faces back at his kingdom. So he'll need some kind of veto authority on the challenges that will otherwise be judged by some kind of neutral council. Once she's back in the man's kingdom as the queen-to-be, unofficial until the coronation, she will help the man's sisters with unwanted, powerful demon prince suitors and help them rescue their loves, lovers, spouses, etc., who have been transformed in some way to keep them away from the sisters. Looking to have her necromancer powers be how she ends up helping in some way. I'd like the traits tested in the challenges, or maybe even the types of challenges themselves, help her in some way with helping the sisters. Wow, so sorry for the wall of text. Yeah, that was a lot, and so I don't think I got every single detail of that, but I think that's okay. I think we have a lot to work with here. First of all, the first thing that stuck out to me with this is that I really like how you have a good inherent conflict baked into the premise, and so that makes it a little bit easier to figure out what these challenges maybe should be in spirit. But okay, yeah, let's brainstorm. Let's have a little bit of fun with this. And I think that, romantasy is not necessarily something that I have a ton of experience in. I haven't even read that much of it. I've read a decent amount, I guess, but it's not my preferred genre. But I do think elements of romantasy, I think, can be a lot of fun, and I can see why they're so appealing to folks, and yeah, all that good stuff. So, okay, let's talk about it. So we're looking for tests and competitions for marriage candidates that aren't combat-focused, but are still dangerous and deadly. She mentioned Harry Potter, and so, yeah, the first book kind of has like, they have to get to the stone, and it's a very harrowing kind of Goonies kind of layout kind of thing. And that's fun because this is the kind of creative world building that can get a reader really excited because the difficulty, the challenges are baked into a motivation that's inherently interesting. A question, right? What makes you a good ruler? And so you have to let that inform what these challenges are, right? Because being in charge of other people, there's a lot more to that than just who can swing a sword the hardest, right? And I think the idea of making the female main character a necromancer, that gives you a lot of opportunities as well, because necromancy is a magical ability that has a lot of layers to it and a lot of kind of, I guess, controversy or edge to it that you can exploit as well. So, all right, let's dissect some fantasy trial ideas. I think that this is a good setup. We've got political stakes, we've got hidden identities, a cursed kingdom that really stuck out to me. We have a morally conflicted protagonist, and we're keeping this rooted in YA fantasy, right? I do think it's kind of interesting because it's YA, so she's going to be a very young queen, but sure, why not? Okay, so trials that would test a queen's worth without being straight up combat. And I do think that it's good to get away from the sort of like, oh, the girl has to prove herself by being better than dudes with a bow and arrow, because we've seen that so many times, right? So that's a good place to start. If we're talking about examples of YA fantasy that does this well, one of the examples I thought of was, I think, The Queen's Rising by Rebecca Ross does this pretty well, at least well in a way that I think suits what I think Artemis is looking for. Because that book has a protagonist who is trained in more artistic pursuits. So it's way more than swordplay or battle tactics. It's a lot more about knowledge, cunning, the ability to read a room, right? So we should probably lean a little bit on that for some inspiration for sure. I think for me, sometimes the best rulers in these fantasy stories are not the ones who can fight the best, but they're the ones who can outthink their enemies. Sometimes it's like either outthinking their enemies or just being like a moral paragon in a very specific way. Think the Dragon Prince, if you've watched that show, and Ezran, what makes him a good ruler? He's not one of the fighters of the group, but he is the youngest, but he's also very wise and giving and generous. And that has a lot to do, that empathy has a lot to do with what makes him suitable to be a ruler. Another book that also is coming to mind for me would be The Cruel Prince, a pretty popular one by Holly Black. I think the character in that, Jude, I think their whole journey in it's way more about court politics. It's not really about winning duels. It's about manipulating power and surviving sabotage, proving that you can play the game better than anyone else. It's a more modernized version of Game of Thrones, and it has a little bit more activity to it, I guess, compared to Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones is so long in the tooth. You can't really use that as much inspiration for YA fantasy because it's such a different beast. But Cruel Prince would definitely be a good example to draw from as well. So let's workshop some actual trials that would fit into Artemis's story. So we want something deadly. We want something clever, politically charged. They have to be tests. These need to be the kinds of things that prove she's fit to rule without just proving that, oh yeah, she can fight, big deal, who cares? So another one something I'm kind of thinking of is the Lying Game in the Queen's Thief series by Megan Whalen Turner. So in this one, the candidates have to uncover a court conspiracy. They don't have a lot of time to do it. And my favorite, the trick is, it's really cool. Someone's feeding them lies. And so it's kind of just making everything even more complicated. There was like a cooking reality TV show that was kind of like this, The Rat in the Kitchen, where everyone's competing to try to like make this dish. But like one of the chefs is actually secretly trying to sabotage everyone. And then at the end of the trial, everyone kind of guesses like, all right, who was the saboteur, right? And that makes it kind of fun because then you get to like go around and be like, who, it's more about you have to survive the sabotage, but then you also have to figure out like who the saboteur is at the same time. And that, to me, that's a good test of if you're able to be in charge, if you're a good ruler, because you have to discern who is trustworthy, who do you keep around you, what's real, right? And who's just trying to deceive you. That's perfect for a future queen to consider because, again, being a ruler isn't just about brute strength. You have to see through manipulation, know who to trust, be able to make a decision when you don't have all the facts. Another one we could do, maybe if we wanted to bring the necromancer flair into it, is, well, put the candidates into a crypt. that has a whole bunch of spirits who are refusing to move on, right? And maybe the trial has to do with helping one of them find peace, before sunrise. I think that the trick here is that the main character, I think, is a secret necromancer. So this is maybe something, it's less about like using the necromancer ability, but more about having that connection to the undead that gives her the leg up in this. That would be kind of unexpected, but she has to still be able to use her talent without exposing it or exposing secrets. And that's actually a really great trial for somebody who wants to be a ruler, even outside of the parameters of the trial itself. And so, each spirit, for example, could have like some kind of unfinished business tied to the history of this cursed kingdom, which means you have candidates who have to use diplomacy, historical knowledge, they have to use emotional intelligence, be able to communicate with these spirits in order to unravel what's keeping these souls tethered, right? And this would be super excruciating for a necromancer female main character because she has a natural talent for speaking to the dead, but she has to hide it. She can't overdo it. And another thing that I would like about something like this too is it does feel deadly, right? Because some of these spirits can be dangerous. A crypt is very spooky. You can have a haunting atmosphere, and you can really mix it up from like the court politics stuff. So you have like a nice range there. So yeah, and me personally, I love a quiet kind of horror. Like I like it when horror is like, it's not like the swords and the battles. It's more about the history, the world building, the grief of this kingdom kind of coming into play and just making that atmosphere really thick with tension. And also, if you have the female main character fail, maybe the spirits go feral, right? And they start attacking her. And then you start to up the stakes there. And, you can have a test that isn't about fighting, but you can still have some fighting, if you want to have at least a little bit of action in the story. Even if it's just her running and hiding, I guess. I guess it sort of depends. Maybe she has to use her necromancer powers. I don't know. You figure it out. Let's do maybe just one more. Let's, for this one, let's talk about negotiations, right? I think that being able to broker peace between two rival factions, empires, countries, whatever, that is such a big part of being a ruler, right? And the stakes are super high with that sort of thing. You have the lives of so many people in your hands. And so for your factions, you could, it could be noble houses. That's very common for a queen to have to negotiate. It could be a group of rebels with the main kingdom. It could be maybe a merchant guild that is, maybe feuding or causing some kind of blockade or something like that. Whatever fits your world, right? It's a cursed kingdom, so, whatever kind of fits that motif. But for this negotiation, you can include maybe like a hidden clause, right? So if they make an unwise promise or if they fail to see the bigger picture, then the agreement is going to immediately fall apart. You could, in order to make this a little bit more dangerous and a little bit more perilous, you could build this around like a supernatural contract that enforces the deal. Think like Fae stuff, since this is romantasy. Maybe the two groups already know, right, that they're being tested and are setting them up for failure. So then in that case, you'd be testing political acumen, the ability to think and make good decisions under pressure, and whether or not you as a ruler can inspire actual loyalty, not just compliance. Now, Artemis did mention that the main character loses the final trial because she saves another competitor. And I think this is a good move. It's a little bit tropey, and that's okay. We like tropes. We just have to do the tropes well so they aren't cliche, right? And if you do it right, I love it when this sort of thing is done right, because it challenges the idea, right, that winning automatically means best queen. And so you can imagine the final test, for example, being a choice between like a personal victory or somebody else's survival. Maybe it's a labyrinth with only one exit, a ritual where one of the candidates has to be sacrificed. I don't know, whatever it is. But, you could have your main character making some kind of just snap decision to help somebody else. And then that's the moment the Cursed Prince sees her for what she is, right? Not the best competitor, but the best ruler. And me personally, I would subvert it even further and make it so that the Cursed Prince is like an antagonist, and her, winning doesn't mean her marrying this dude, but rather, just being the queen on her own. Who needs this Cursed Prince? I sure don't. I don't know. I'm just kind of spitballing, but yeah, I think that then you could root the story itself, the premise of the story itself around, real power isn't about winning and coming out on top, at least in terms of the power that you want to see in the world. It's about what you do when you could take power, but you choose not to. I think in this day and age, especially, we live in a time where it just seems like the people with power are constantly destroying everybody else's lives just for their own gains. And so that's a really palpable tension in the world right now, all over the world. And so you want to, with your story, really build that around like reading the room, right? And not being like being in charge is the best, and it's all about stepping on other people. You want to be mindful about that sort of thing. I assume this person is, because I get that sense from their story and how they're describing their main character. But if they do that, I think that if you lean into these kinds of challenges, I think this person has a good instinct for how that would make this story interesting. Then yeah, I think they're going to land on something pretty unique. So I'm going to try to run through the books I mentioned. So we mentioned Queen's Rising. I think that that's a good example. Cruel Prince for sure. Queen's Thief series we mentioned, and what's another one? I think if you want to find something too with like necromancers that I think is kind of a fun inspiration, would be the Bone Season. If Artemis hasn't checked that out already, or anybody who's interested, that might also be a good one to maybe lean on as well for just like details and an idea of what's been done before. But all right, so let's take a look at some of these comments. I'm curious what everybody else might think. We have something here from Wonder and Awe, and they wrote, I'm from an IT background, so I'd start with requirements for a queen and from there come up with challenges. Some stereotypical ones: childcare, protect children in a dangerous situation, or educate a group of children so they will survive a dangerous situation. Is that really like what a queen? I don't know. I feel like queens have to be in charge of everybody, not just children. But I get it. I get like the idea, but it feels a little bit too much like the test is to be a mother or to be a parent, I should say. I don't know. Decision-making. Yes, definitely decision-making. Solomon choice scenario where there is a no-win situation with someone's life at stake. Hosting skills. Plan/survive a ball with some enemies without starting a war/assassination. Yeah, that's a fun idea too. I'll take a look at another comment here. Ben Erexis writes, or I think they're just asking a question. We'll skip that one. Adiantum Veneris writes, let them solve challenges that are actually relevant for a queen that's more than just a pretty face. Challenge 1, conflict resolution. Oh yeah, like what I said. The candidate is presented with a complex conflict involving the interest of 5 parties, represented by real people. She needs to find a solution which all 5 will agree to, have all of them feel like they got a desirable outcome. For extra difficulty, she will be competing with other candidates directly, meaning she needs to get all parties to accept her solution over the others. It won't be officially stated, but if she can get them to agree to a solution that benefits her as well, it puts her in a much better place. Yeah, my only thing with this is I think between 5 parties, it's a bit complicated and it would take a lot of word count. I'd say just keeping it between 2. Keep it simple. Simple can be impactful. I think 5 is a little bit too political and complicated, and I think some readers would be like, who's that? What's that? Where? Why? When? How? 2 would be a little bit easier to wrangle, without losing the forest for the trees, or whatever the saying is. And then challenge 2, finance. Each candidate is given a fixed amount of money and tasked with putting together, they've just put insert a setting relevant op project here. The trick being the sum they're being given is deliberately insufficient. Candidates are not allowed to use their own funds. They need to find a way to pull off the task without anyone noticing something is amiss. This can be solved either by being extremely efficient, negotiating prices, figuring out a way to get more funds, or deploying creative solutions. Yeah, my only thing with this is that you need it to feel dangerous because they want this to have that kind of dangerous quality. But I like the idea, right? Finances are super important to being in charge. I think that Artemis just needs to find a way to make stuff like this feel a little bit more like a deadly competition, like the stakes are really high. But yeah, that's all part of the brainstorming process. How could you do that with finances? I'm sure there are plenty of ways. And without it devolving into, some kind of like Witcher 3 side quest kind of thing where it's like we have to go to the safe house and we have to, maybe it includes some sneaking around, or maybe the deadly stuff is not necessarily the challenge itself, but having to pull off the challenge based on her weaknesses puts her in a more dangerous situation than everyone else. That's kind of something that you get from Fourth Wing because, in the early parts of that book, I think like the only way she can kind of survive is that she has to sort of, she has to like do these complicated sleuthing things in order to get an advantage over the people she fights, that kind of thing. So it's not, it's already kind of a deadly challenge, but it's made deadlier by the fact that if she gets caught, she's donezo. And then this person keeps going. Challenge 3, policy. The candidates are presented with a real challenge their theoretical country might face. Well, it's a cursed kingdom. They must construct a policy seeking to address it. and convince the council to accept their solution. So ideally, the most effective, easiest to implement. Unofficially, this also tests their grasp on internal politics because the council consists of people who have a conflict of interest regarding the more obvious solutions, and they will need to account for it, either being very original or being very good at forcing them to cooperate. Yeah, I think again, this is like the finance thing. It's like, I don't know, it's kind of dry. It's just kind of like, well, she's a necromancer. Like, how does that? It's a cursed kingdom, so you want to find challenges that are just a little bit more magically interesting, I guess. Like, and this definitely fits the idea, but it just evolves into a bunch of people just kind of talking. It's like, I got to come up with this policy. How am I going to come up with this policy? Let's get everybody into it. It starts to feel a little bit too Washington, D.C., and that's just not quite as interesting. So, yeah, I mean, I think the nugget of it, you would want to incorporate it in some way, but I don't know. I feel like it's a little bit too samey with the other ones too, my opinion. Then they write Challenge 4 is their last one, and they write for a much darker tone and a less pragmatic approach. Advocacy. The candidates are presented with a misdeed they are supposedly guilty of. There you go. I like this one. Can be something from their past or staged. They need to prove to the council that they are not actually to blame. The council doesn't actually care if they're to blame or not. They're testing their skill at making a case for themselves, their willingness to be held accountable, and how they handle pressure. Yeah, that's to me is a really great suggestion, because then I can see like, oh yeah, okay, this is where some of the dangerous stuff comes in. Not just because of like physical danger, this involves emotional danger, because if secrets are brought up from your past, being able to handle them, being in these pressure cooker situations, now that is very, very, easy to write, in the sense it's easy to kind of get across that feeling of dread that I think the author is going for. So, all right, cool. So that was a longer one, so we'll call it there. There were plenty of other comments here, lots of brainstorming going on. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to our fact checker, Bridget Surdock, our wonderful producer, Bridget Surdock, to give me some notes. Let me know if I missed anything or if I messed anything up, and then we'll finish out the show there. So don't go away. Going to be right back. And we're back. All right, so let's take a look at producer Bridget's notes on what we discussed so far. Here's what Bridget had to say. Bridget wrote, Gideon the Ninth also has a lot of tests and trials that are potentially deadly. Yeah, Gideon the Ninth, good example there. I would definitely say I'm not the biggest Gideon the Ninth fan. I'm a fan of it in the sense that I really like the writing style. The world of Gideon the Ninth, really hard for me to get into. It's a me thing. It's not the Lock Tomb series as a whole. I'm a fan of the concept and the approach of it, but when I've tried to read those books, I kind of get tripped up. But anyway, Bridget wrote, they're obviously necromancy suited, so not the best for looking for qualities and traits in a queen. Yeah, but I guess since the story we're talking about does have a necromancer, that's a good point, that Gideon the Ninth could be pretty helpful there as inspiration. Bridget writes, but the trials are given to the characters with no further explanation on what to do or how to achieve, in the hopes that they would eventually work together to become lictors. Which doesn't work. Things devolve pretty quickly, with an immortal, all-powerful serial killer on the premises, but still. Yeah, I would say that there's something interesting to this idea where it's like, well, what if the tests and the trials, one of the things that makes them dangerous is you don't even know what you're trying to do? That's kind of a fun thing. Even if it was just one trial, it wouldn't have to be all of them, right? But if it was just sort of, you're thrown into something in the middle of it and you just got to figure it out. That's kind of interesting because, yeah, you're a ruler. You have to think on your feet. You have to make tough decisions without all the context in the world. So that makes sense. Bridget writes, the idea of introducing the trials and making it seem like whoever will be queen is dependent on whoever wins the most trials, but switching it up to whoever works the best with others or some other arbitrary ideal the cursed king is looking for could work. The actual test is not the trials, but how the participants behave in them, maybe. I would also say that when constructing these trials, think about what dangers in the cursed kingdom the protagonist will have to come up against. Yeah, I think that, I was kind of touching on this too, for sure, but that is a great way to look at it again, is that what really counts as a victory? Is it completing the challenge in a way of like, I'm better than these other people? Or could you think a little differently and say, what if it's not me being the best at something, but instead it's me being able to accomplish a specific thing with the help of other people? You could kind of change the rules on that sort of thing. And I like that idea. In terms of, how the participants behave in the trials, I do think that there again, I mentioned this before. There's a little bit of a danger of a cliche there, where it's sort of like, Harry Potter, right? It's like, oh, well, he wins the house cup because, the points show up out of nowhere. And it's a little bit more of like, oh, it's not the destination, it's the friends we made along the way. It can feel a little trite if you don't handle it well. It can feel like a cop out too. I personally like it when consequences stay as consequences. So the consequences for losing the competition are that you lose the competition and you don't get bailed out by some deus ex machina or some kind of plot contrivance that allows for you to win anyway or win in spirit. Or actually, I should say, I like the idea more of winning in spirit, of like, all right, we lost, but the point is that, we learned this lesson and it works out in the end. Or maybe it's better that we lost because you don't want to be the queen, but you instead want to run off and, be an awesome person doing other stuff. I don't know. I even had this thought too after I was kind of pondering this a little bit after the initial recording, and I was thinking, it would be kind of cool if this was one of those things where it turns out that the trials had a totally different motivation. It wasn't for you to become the queen, but instead to become something else, like a grand advisor, or to be some other kind of unexpected, like the archmage, and it turns out to be this kind of this gambit, as it were. Because I was thinking about that. I was like, oh, all these trials to become, a queen. And really, it's just sort of like the Cinderella thing, where it's like, oh yeah, who fits the shoe? Well, we're gonna have this big ball. But if it turned out of like, oh, if you're the smartest person, maybe that means something else. And this is how we figure out who the smartest person is. The competition would have to be different in the sense that we wouldn't tell you right away what the real purpose of this is because we really want to evaluate you in a totally different context, whatever it is. I'm kind of just I'm all over the place on this, but that's how it goes sometimes. Bridget wrote, if there are specific enemies or environments or what have you that they'll come in contact with, maybe it is a distinctly fey curse or of some kind. And whoever the queen is will have to be someone who can navigate fey conversations or understand fey laws. Maybe the air is thinner where the castle is, be it altitude or the curse, and the queen has to be able to withstand that. And so one of the trials includes like climbing a really tall mountain or tree. Yeah, this is all pretty interesting stuff, especially like anything that's kind of like death defying rather than like combat is going to be fun. And you can write a scene like that in a very interesting way. You just have to remember that sometimes upping the stakes means having to, instead of like the combat thing, maybe like add in something that makes everything like, okay, here's an example because I'm having a hard time explaining it. But in Goblet of Fire, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, an example of this would be when Harry does the thing where he has to breathe underwater and he has to go get the thing, but okay, it's like, it's kind of dangerous. There's stuff in the water. But really what we find out is that, oh, a bunch of people were captured, a bunch of his friends, and he has to save them. And so that's a complication that comes in that's unexpected. And so that kind of thing can be, like, oh, it's a bigger deal than we thought of at first glance. And so now we have to deal with this thing even. And so that can be kind of a fun way to mix things up. I've talked about on the show before, I don't know a ton about fey curses. So I haven't read a lot of the hot romantasy, that does the fey stuff. I think Crown and Thorn Roses is the big one, but I know there are others. But anyway, fey stuff I'm just not as versed in. Bridget wrote, maybe the enemies of the Cursed King rely heavily on poison. So one of the trials is being able to identify when food has been poisoned. Or maybe making an antidote while poisoned. Yeah, that gives me heavy Apothecary Diaries vibes. And so anybody listening is interested, Apothecary Diaries is a wonderful anime. I love it so much. And that anime is a great example of there's no combat in it, but it is deadly. And the trials in that sense are more sort of the main character having to solve these kinds of mysteries. She's like a Sherlock Holmes apothecary character. And the setups in Apothecary Diaries do feel dangerous. They do feel like huge challenges because of just very specifically how it's written and the main character and how she comes across. So highly, highly recommend that. Bridget wrote, what factors would the protagonist not have interacted with in her day-to-day that would come up once going into the Cursed Kingdom? Additionally, why does the Cursed Prince want to find a queen? Yeah, that's a great point too, because I was thinking like, why is she in this situation in a macro level, right? And I'm sure, of course, that the Artemis, the author of this, I'm sure that there's like a lot of this stuff figured out, and we're not privy to it, of course. But what we're saying is you can factor in that motivation in order to, inform what some of these trials are, inform sort of the consequences of becoming queen in a kingdom like this. All of this stuff, including the trials, it needs to go together pretty cohesively. It needs to feel of a piece. And it's the old A Song of Ice and Fire maxim, I think, which is that one of the reasons Game of Thrones, the books really work and the show stopped working once they really went off book, it's not because they couldn't come up with original stuff, because there's original stuff in Game of Thrones, the show, that was good, that was interesting and well written. However, when it came to the macro stuff with that story, the reason the books worked better is because the choices the characters made, the situations they were in, the world they existed in, it was always cohesive. It was always going together in a way that made sense and that fit. And you could just tell that you had one person writing it who really understood the nuts and bolts of it and heavily edited themselves and all of that. So I'd say that that's kind of what you want to go for, not just in, world building, but how you tell your story and the story of the world that's inside of it. Bridget wrote, is she supposed to help lift the curse? Is he lonely? Is he getting pressure from his court to get married? Does he need a general at his side to help him plan his battles? What is he looking for? That will help you decide what sort of traits he's looking for in his queen. Yeah, and I think there's some stories. I know there's one that I forget the name of it, where you don't know that one of the characters is in disguise, who is like a contestant, but they're actually like one of the judges. I don't know if it was like the Savior's Champion or something like that. I forget what it was, but basically the idea was like, oh, it's this big reveal, like the Cursed Prince. You insert them into the story out of context, and you find out that like, oh yeah, really the trial was the Bachelorette, that kind of the Bachelor, I guess in this case. And now that I bring that up, that's another fun thing to kind of glean from, right? When you have this kind of setup to really evaluate, yes, of course, The Bachelor is going to be a very different kind of story in terms of, that show being, it's reality TV. It has a completely different approach and all of it. In terms of the machinations of it and how the producers of that show come up with the situations that they put the characters in, the drama that happens, that is not far removed from the machinations of what you want to do with this kind of story. Because yeah, it's all about just guiding people through a journey and taking them on something so that they forget where they are for a few hours, if that makes sense. Bridget wrote, another series that has trials that I forgot about before, Avatar: The Last Airbender, Season 1, Episode 5, The King of Omashu. The trials Aang faces are deadly, but not combat-driven until the final one. Yeah, that's true. They're more sort of like tests of skill and things like that. And, I would personally, I'm always down for a dance competition. If you're going to do the gala ball thing, have the characters do a dance-off. I'm always a sucker for a dance-off. In fact, one of my favorite ones in this kind of context would be A Knight's Tale. And A Knight's Tale, it's a trial in the sense that our main character, Sir Ulrich, and by the way, Knight's Tale, one of my all-time favorite movies, my number 2. I love that movie, and I love the scene where he has to kind of like, pretend to be this guy of noble birth, and they have this kind of dance-off, but it's within like the, the Middle Ages kind of motif, and it's really funny. But the way that he kind of adapts to it and he gets help from other people. And yeah, it's not combat. The whole movie has been combat up until this point. But the point is that this is a trial, My Fair Lady. It's trying to, put this fish out of water, character in an uncomfortable situation and watch them adapt. And it's fun to see them succeed in this kind of situation. And it gets you turning pages. Bridget wrote, the conflict resolution idea that one commenter gave of getting 5 people to agree to one thing could be an unofficial trial, like something going on in the background. Yeah, that's another great thing to remember, is that some of the trials, you might not know that they're happening. That's popped up in stories and movies before, but I don't think it's been overdone. So you could definitely make good use of it. But the idea that like, oh, this was a trial, we didn't even realize, or, maybe there's debate or like, is this a trial? I don't know. But, it adds to the tension. It adds to the stress of the story. I would love the idea if it's like, they think it's a trial but then they find out like, wait, that wasn't a trial. We almost died. You can do fun things like that to kind of break it up and maybe take the piss out of the story from time to time if you want. Bridget wrote, all the contestants are in this for vastly different motivations and have different reasons for being here. And maybe the protagonist solves some interpersonal stuff in between the trials that makes them all get along better, allows them to all feel like they've won something, and puts the protagonist in a better position as well. Yeah, you know what? That reminds me of Miss Congeniality, another good movie. But Miss Congeniality is very much like that kind of story where really when it comes down to it, it's not about her winning the competition. And I don't know how, I know we have some listeners who might be too young and they might not remember this movie, but I recommend it. It's a fun one. But it's this idea like this FBI agent is going undercover at this beauty pageant. It's like Miss America or something. And because like one of them is a killer. And basically like the movie is really, it's not about her winning the competition or even finding the killer. It's about her and these women like becoming friends and dealing with their interpersonal stuff and becoming better people through the process. And it's wonderful and lovely. And she is Miss Congeniality, Sandra Bullock anyway. So yeah, you could do something like that. That would be really fun for sure. Bridget wrote, it'd save on word count and make her seem more competent because it wasn't an official trial at all. But the Cursed King still saw it and cites it when he explains why he chose her. My only thing with this is you have to be careful, and I've already brought this up. You have to be careful not to pull the wool or the rug up from under the reader. If you tell the reader these are the rules of the trial, but then again, if it'll feel like a plot contrivance, it was like, well, I watched you do this thing, and I've decided to change the rules at the last minute. It works better if you foreshadow it. If you make it feel like not that it's expected, but more inevitable that like, yes, this has been an experience where the rules do change from time to time. And the opinions of the different judges, in this case, the prince, are flexible for a very specific and good reason. So yeah, I would keep that in mind because, it can definitely help you make sure that the story doesn't kind of go off in a direction that doesn't feel earned, if that makes sense. Bridget wrote, Agatha All Along is another one that has a lot of fun and deadly trials. Yeah, I never finished Agatha All Along. I watched like 3 episodes. I liked it. I just, I kept forgetting it existed. So yeah, one of these days I gotta finish that one. Bridget wrote, the finance trial could be a survival trial instead, but the contestants' abilities to survive is inherently predicated on their ability to work together and trade. One contestant is dropped closest to the main source of fresh water, another is near edible berries, another is right near a cave system providing natural shelter. So first, it seems like mere survival, but then it becomes obvious that the only way to survive is to work together, and if they can't do that, to trade with each other at the very least. This could also fill the conflict resolution trial as well, while still looking like a survival trial. I think I'm going to stop here. I could probably keep brainstorming for a while, but soon enough, I'll start writing the dang thing if I'm not too careful. Well, thank you, Bridget. Your ideas are wonderful. And on that last one, honestly, that whole setup, the thing is, that whole setup feels more like a setup for like a novel's worth of content, especially because at that point, your themes start to be really a thesis on capitalism. Because if you have a situation where you're all on this island and people have different resources and they're competing for things and one person holds all of something and this idea of like private property, that gets into like, oh yeah, now the story is about capitalism. Now it's sort of about how do you deal with this? And so that might be a little bit heavier than I think, we could deal with, but it's a great premise for a story, even a short story or something like that, to really dig into, that kind of setup. Cause that is super interesting. Like that's inherently interesting to me, but it would be more of like the whole novel is about, we're going to select a queen, but through this like wild survival scenario that has more, this kind of setup rather than these different trials where we finish the trial, then we reconvene and so on and so on. But anyway, lots of fun ideas in here. Hopefully you found them interesting. And of course, I hope that Artemis appreciated our insights. I'm sure they've received, I saw there was a ton of comments already. And so I'm sure they've gotten so many suggestions. It's fun to do brainstorming. I do hesitate. I should have said this at the outset, but I do hesitate sometimes to talk too much brainstorming because at a certain point, you do need to do the work, right? You can't just expect other people to think of this stuff for you. But at the same time, I think that this still is illustrative of there are so many directions you can take with a story, so many different things. And my thing with this in particular is because Artemis was so specific about, here's the context for my story, here's what I'm trying to do, it was much easier for it to feel like this is still their story. This is still the thing that they are trying to write. It's not sort of like, I don't know what to do, figure it out for me. That's kind of the vibe where I would not take, I think that's why Natalia, brought this one to me, because she probably, had the same idea that like, yeah, this is a sense where it's a good faith brainstorming session rather than a fix my writing problems for me session, which at that point, it's like,
yeah, you're treating us like an AI tool or something, which better than AI, to be fair, but not that much better, I guess. But anyway, hopefully that was super helpful for Artemis, and thank you so much. And hopefully it's helpful to any of you listening who might have an idea of, maybe it's not trials, but trying to piece together stuff in your story, think differently in different, respects of how you can put your story together in a way that's meaningful to you and that suits the kind of thematic stuff that you're going for. So thanks as always for listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm going to get out of here. See y'all next one, and be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.